He calls abortion the spiritual battle of our lives. And he firmly believes that abortion will end when men make it so. Roe v. Wade has been overturned, but this former football star says the fight for life has only reached halftime. He is Benjamin Watson, author of the new book, The New Fight for Life, Roe, Race, and a Pro-Life Commitment to Justice, published by Tyndale Momentum. You may already be listening or watching and know quite a bit about abortion, but I'm going to guess that you've never seen the subject explored quite from this angle. Watson argues this, quote, ignorance of or disregard for racial justice, especially by some white pro-life evangelicals, has been a hurdle to unifying and expanding the movement, end quote. He's not content to pass legal restrictions or even ban abortion. He describes, quote, a higher, more complete calling to address the factors that drive abortion decisions. And in this book, Watson comes prepared with an array of statistics that may surprise you. Surveys show that 76% of abortive mothers would prefer to parent the child under different circumstances. 40% of the women who abort their children attend church regularly. Watson describes a, quote, crucible of susceptibility that helps explain why 40% of women seeking abortion are black. Compared to white women, black women in the United States are 4 times more likely to have an abortion. Black women are also 3 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related causes. And he explains that black women have been warned that if abortion is restricted or banned, more of them will die in childbirth. In this book, Watson is not afraid to step on toes or tell Christians that they need to step up in the fight for life. He sees hope in the gospel and in the church. He writes this, as a church, we need to become a safe haven, a refuge, a place where the most vulnerable can turn, not just for spiritual help, but for emotional, material, and financial support too. Watson joins me today on Gospelbound to discuss the role of men in the pro-life cause, the relationship between history and agency, and the responsibility of parents to talk to their kids about sex, among other subjects. Ben, thanks for joining me on Gospelbound.
Man, it's good to be with you. I'm excited about this conversation. Thank you.
It's an important one, and it's an important book. And Ben, did you write this book in response to the end of Roe v. Wade, or did that decision in 2022 alter some of your previous plans to write this book?
Collin, I had no plans to write this book. I think there are a lot of other topics that we could talk about that might be a little easier to discuss. Maybe not as important as this one, because this is very important. But it's one of those topics, and I think the convergence of life as well as race in America are 2 topics that bring a lot of emotion and a lot of history and a lot of baggage. I believe that we have to speak about these things as believers because, as you mentioned, we do have hope in the gospel, but we also understand the fact that people bear God's image and that we have to stand in the gap and that we have to speak about any type of person that's being taken advantage of or vulnerability, all those sorts of things. We have a mandate to do so. And we see that in Scripture when it comes to justice and those sorts of things. But the book was really not necessarily a response to Roe being overturned, but more of an encouragement to the pro-life movement. The many different factions of the pro-life movement, whether it's Catholics or evangelicals or people who don't even have a faith. I mean, there are atheists for life. I mean, there are all these sorts of people, but people that think that abortion is an attack against a human person, that think that preborn children should be protected. My hope and my goal in writing the book was to encourage them that this is halftime. I played a lot of football, and to use a football analogy, when you come in the locker room and the coach is evaluating what happened in the first half and going over the game plan and seeing what needs to change and encouraging you that you got to go back out there and keep on fighting because the game's not over. It's a response to that because after Roe was overturned, there seemed to be a bit of apathy that set in for some, thinking that this is over. And as we know from a political standpoint, but also just from a communal and systemic, and the factors are still there why women seek abortion. We as pro-lifers have to keep going, and that's why I wrote the book.
You know, Ben, the path from football star to pro-life activist is not the most common. Help us just to know how you got there.
How I got here. I always wonder about that, to be honest with you. People ask that question a lot, and it was not a situation when I woke up one morning and said, this is a fight I want to get in. But I will say this. I was raised by two God-fearing, God-loving, Bible-believing parents. My mother and father, they're still with us. They are leaders in their community. My father's a pastor in South Carolina. But they always taught us and demonstrated to us the importance of humans and of children and of people that are in different areas of their life, whether they be the preborn, women, men, people who are poor, wealthy. It didn't matter. They taught us the value of human dignity. And so from a very early age, I remember having just a worldview that was based on caring about people. Now, I didn't get along with everybody. I spoke poorly of a lot of people, and I still do sometimes. But that's just this understanding in our household that life mattered, and human life was different than the animal counterparts. And so I think for us, we had our first child in 2009, Grace. She's 14 years old now. And I remember going and doing the 3D 4D ultrasound. And we're sitting there and looking at the 3D 4D ultrasound. And my wife says to me when we leave, she said, you know what, one day I would love to provide this service for pregnant women. Now, we've since had 6 children. I'm a pro at reading an ultrasound now. I know everything about it. Hey, I don't need the doctor in there or anything, Collin. Like, I know everything about it now. But fast forward about 8 years from that point, and we were able to start purchasing ultrasound units and donating them to pregnancy resource centers in areas where I played. So Baltimore, Maryland, and New Orleans, Louisiana, and my hometown in South Carolina, and several different places where we had lived. We saw that as an opportunity to step in and to provide that service, because we do know that when men and women see the ultrasound image, it changes how they view life in the womb. When you're in the NFL and you do those sorts of things, sometimes I guess it makes headlines. And so that kind of got us started. And I did a few articles, had an opportunity to speak at the March for Life. And currently I work with an organization called Human Coalition, and we provide direct services to pregnant women. We also have a legislation arm, Human Coalition Action. And so this has been a journey that has really just picked up, I would say, over the last 8 years, but it's always been something, along with a bunch of other issues that I like to call issues of justice or human flourishing, that we've been involved with as a family.
Now, there's going to be some people, Ben, who they see 2 men talking here about abortion, and they're just automatically going to dismiss us as a result. So let's talk about what you see as the role of men in the fight for life.
23 and 23, Collin. 23 and 23. What do I mean by that? Well, there's 46 chromosomes in every person. 23 and 23. And so men have a role biologically, no matter what the motto or the mantra or the prevailing winds of culture will say and tell men. We have a role. So that's number one. And whenever I have an opportunity to talk to men about this issue, I firmly believe that abortion ends when men say it will end. And so many women who, within those first 48 hours when they're making a decision, and so many women would say, you mentioned that 76% stat, and we'll talk about that later, but many of them would say, if I had a relationship with the father, or not even a relationship, if the father said that I will just be there, not that I can provide everything, not that I'm not scared, but no, we're going to do this together. It changes her outlook. And so what Satan always tries to do is to disrupt order and disrupt relationships between man and woman. We see it in the garden. We see it in the very beginning. This is not a new ploy. This is what he does in so many different aspects of our life. It is about disrupting order, disrupting respect between man and woman, disrupting the complementarianism between men and women. And so abortion is a primary example of that. And so I always tell men, look, we have a voice, we have a role, we're needed, we're necessary. The key is, are we willing to perhaps stand up against a culture that is telling us that we aren't necessary? And also, I think that part of it is us admitting collectively as men that many times we haven't been who we need to be. Now, sometimes a man is not present because of extenuating circumstances. Sure. He may be experiencing his own injustice that removes him. He may have something else that's not his fault. He wants to be there. I've had teammates who have told me, man, I wanted to be there, and then my girlfriend went and got an abortion and I didn't know. So there are many men who are out here hurting. But I think collectively we have to admit that, we haven't served and loved and many times been responsible in the ways that we should. How do we change and direct and make that right instead of continuing to go along the path that we're going?
Of course, one of the major themes of this book, the interplay we've been talking about already between abortion, race, and justice. And I have a feeling that many people who would consider themselves pro-life activists, even perhaps students of the movement, especially if they're white, just might not be aware of some of the history that you cover. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the most fascinating and certainly tragic components of the book is the history behind what you describe about Black women as the, quote, deep-seated desire for bodily autonomy and control over their own future. Why don't you give us just a brief overview? It's quite a significant section of the book, but give us just a brief overview for somebody who just doesn't really know what that means when you say that.
Yeah. I think if I was going to write this book, my truest desire was to speak the truth about the issue of abortion, but specifically to hone in on the fact that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely than their white counterparts to get abortions, and to give voice to why. Yeah. Because so often in pro-life circles, what I've noticed, and mostly this doesn't happen as much in many Black pro-life circles, but I'm in both, a lot of different pro-life circles. And many times what I hear as a statistic is Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely. So why do Black people vote Democrat? Or it always goes somewhere from there, but no one ever talks about why is that the case? Can we guess? Can we talk about it? Can we discuss? Why is it the case that this subset of women is more likely? Do Black men and women just like aborting their children more than any other ethnicity? I mean, if that's what you believe, then say that. At least that's an answer. But if that's not the case, I think we need to dig a little bit deeper as to why. And so when it comes to Black women, my goal was really to highlight some of the reasons that they have told me why this issue is important. And you can't disconnect or decouple the present from the past. And so what I mean by that is specifically when it comes to Black women and having autonomy, Black people in general, but specifically Black women, have been at the bottom of the social caste system in this country for hundreds of years. If you don't believe me, you can do your own research, or you can read the book just when it talks about the father of gynecology and the fact that he was doing experimentation on Black enslaved women. The fact that Black women were brought to this country for breeding purposes during chattel slavery, and part of the influx of Black women coming was to reproduce so that there would be more of a slave force. Fast forward up through the 1900s and even up until now, when we look statistically at poverty, at maternal mortality, at so many other social outcomes, Black women many times are at the bottom when it comes to wages and how much they are paid for the same job with the same education as their male counterparts, but specifically their white male counterparts. It is astounding that Black women earn about 58 cents on the dollar. And so there are so many issues. And for many Black women, at least many that I talked to, even in writing this book, who are pro-life, who are against abortion, it's not that they want the right to kill their children. It's that they want the right to have something of their own and to not be forced or prohibited from doing things, because culturally in this country that has happened far too often. And I think that when we think about it in that light, it gives us a little bit more compassion, perhaps in when we hear some of these, quotes from women, specifically even Black women, when it talks about my body, my choice, or whatever it may be, because we understand where they're coming from and why they're saying that. Many times people respond out of their hurt, not necessarily out of their conviction. Many times people respond in defense because they have to draw the line so far away because they've been offended in so many ways, personally and also collectively.
Well, just your answer there, Ben, shows how in the book you do something that I don't see very often. You're exposing the dynamic interplay between history and agency. Sometimes you hear people emphasize history, and then history is destiny. You really can't help it because of what you described there. All you can do is empathize, but you can't change anything. And some people emphasize agency, but they will cut off the history so that they act as if there's no context for why people would make certain decisions. I'm wondering how you try to navigate this at a time when it seems like all different sides just want to portray themselves as victims. How do we move forward in this? And that's what I'm saying. You talked about some of the legitimate concerns of victims right there, but in the way this culture operates, kind of every side is vying to put itself in that position of victimhood. How do you move us toward godly agency to solving this, this horrible injustice of abortion?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. You mentioned victims. I mean, the folks who are, individual responsibility, something happens to one of their champions that they seem is unjust, all of a sudden they're a victim.
Exactly. That's exactly my point.
And it's the way I address it is, and the way I believe scripture shows us, is that there are some people who are victims. Like, victimhood is not, we have an entire legal system that is based on someone being a victim. And how do we protect them? Right. There is nothing inherently wrong. It's not a victim's fault, but we've taken victim and turned it into some sort of pathology. Specifically, I'll be frank, I feel, especially as a Black man, many times people say they'll use the term, a pathology of victimhood, or they have a spirit of victimhood. And I'm thinking, well, many people have been victimized. Sure. And so the issue is not a spirit of victimhood. It is seeing where you've been victimized and the victimizer seeing where they victimized you and then correcting that. And that's what we see in scripture. That's what we see in James when it talks about, not paying people fair wages.
That's what we see from, you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. It's justice. That's what we see from Zacchaeus when he was victimizing people and he repaid them 4 times. I mean, there are numerous examples in the Bible of victims, and you always see God's heart lean towards, not that he's against the wealthy or those in power. There's nothing wrong with having wealth. There's a problem with using it as to abuse. But you see his heart for those who are victimized and those who are oppressed and those who are in the bottom of society. And so the way I talk about it is just simply being frank. That's why it's important that we have a good understanding of history. And what I mean by history, I mean, when we started this interview back, I don't necessarily mean 100 years ago. I mean from today back. It's important that we have an understanding of history, because then we don't have to use these euphemisms for what we mean. We can actually come to the table and say these things have happened, and there's some things that we're not going to discover till later, and some things are happening right now that we won't know till later. But as much as we can, we want to be a people of restoration and reconciliation and and protection and redress for those who have been legitimately victimized.
It's almost like in this book, Ben, and I think this is consistent with your public profile. Years ago, my wife kept kind of elbowing me, saying, "You got to check out this Facebook post from Ben Watson. It's amazing in there." But it's almost like I just don't see many people like this. It's almost like you wander often into the no man's land. Different people, they're in their trenches, they're taking their shots, and there you are, sort of like walking down in no man's land, and you're pointing out the problems all over the place while the bullets are flying. And so people have already gotten a taste here of the book, of just the way that you try to approach the issue from many different perspectives. There's lots of these tough, straightforward words in the book, but I do think that maybe the most pointed words in the entire book concern black pastors. Obviously, we're not talking about all black pastors here. You've talked about your father as an example in here. Yeah. But here's a quote from the book. You say, "Some of our most well-known shepherds are leading their flock off a cliff for a bag of silver and a fleeting moment of popularity. Instead of calling out the value of life amid every attack on human dignity, including policing, incarceration, poverty, elder care, voting rights, and abortion, some leaders have drawn a line of distinction when it comes to the rights of preborn children." Now, as I read that quote, I'm just thinking, Ben, about how we've seen this problem all too often in history. And I teach often on this subject related to white pastors who never confronted slavery or segregation. So the question is not so much about black pastors or white pastors in the civil rights movement, but what is the solution overall to this tendency we have to turn a blind eye to the sins of our allies or friends?
I think that so often, well, there's a couple things. I think so often when it comes to turning a blind eye to the sins of our allies, we many times attach our worth or our identity to our political or social heroes. Yeah. And so what I mean by that is, we'll do politics, for example. If I'm voting for a specific politician, I will absolve him of all guilt on things that I know are wrong because my identity is attached with that person. And that happens for pastors, it happens for lay people, it happens in different sectors. And I think that is bordering on idolatry at times. And it is something we have to be very, very aware of and introspective on, because there's a plumb line that we see in Scripture. And the plumb line doesn't move to the right or the left, depending on who's popular or who's not popular. And we're all held to a certain standard that God has laid out. And so as believers, it's important that we're able to differentiate. I support this person here, but I just don't support him here. When it comes to the pastors that I'm talking about, I've been, especially after Roe was overturned, if you can remember, if the audience can remember, there were several, not just pastors, but a lot of people who came out saying, well, the next step is they're going to take away this right, they're going to take away that right, and all those sorts of things, which we know, as we talked about in the conversation, some of that is a protective mechanism because of historical grievances. Right. I understand that.
Exactly.
But before a pastor, specifically black pastors of large black congregations, to sit in pulpits and not call out, snuffing out life, specifically when it is impacting our community more, specifically when our tradition has been one of taking people in, and people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who stood up for civil rights and for children, and people who, the list goes on and on. Our tradition is one of being socially aware, but also having deep theological foundations. Right. And you see that going all the way back to chattel slavery. And so for them to sit there and do that is not helpful for us. But also, I believe that the Black church is strategically placed to be the conscience of America on this issue, as much as it's been the conscience of America on so many other issues, Collin.
Yeah. Absolutely.
When you look at the civil rights movement and you look at the march from Selma to Montgomery, and they left Brown AME Chapel, and you think about all those who were in those movements, some whose names we don't know, but they were involved with churches, and they met in churches, and they were ministers, and they were women who served in the churches, and these people of great faith who came to America and said, no, this is not right. We're going to fight for this because there is a spiritual mandate behind it. That's where I believe that the Black church, not necessarily the denominations, but also just Black believers, have an opportunity here because abortion impacts us so disproportionately. And so my call to them, and there are plenty of pastors that are doing this thing right. I mean, of all denominations, great friends, people you've interviewed, I can name a whole list, great men I look up to. But then there are some who we must challenge because there are so many that are watching and following them. And this is not, and their stance is not bringing about life. And it's not gonna bring about the flourishing in our communities that we so desperately need.
And using the Bible to justify their anti-life views, which is all sorts of confusion, which is not exclusive to the Black church. We've seen that in Western Michigan as well, in the Reformed Church most recently. It seems like a special kind of heinous evil.
It is, and it's offensive. It's offensive to me personally as a believer. But it should offend all believers when the word of God is misconstrued, when it is used in a way that is not complete, that is not honest, that is not faithful to the text, but used to manipulate, and eventually is really used in order to maintain power or money.
The favor with the allies and exactly what comes with that. Ben, what's it feel like to walk through no man's land? Is that easy? Is that easy for you?
It feels lonely, and sometimes it's funny. People say, well, I was looking at some comments on something that you said, and all the pro-life people, were clapping on one thing, but then on the other thing, they all hated you. It's like, how come? Like, it's so predictable. I know exactly what I know exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I'll tell you this. There are several people who are open and willing to have, I don't want to use this word, but I'll use it because I don't have a better one, a more nuanced approach to some of these things, but it doesn't sell. And the frustrating part is that we live in a culture where you have to be wholesale one way or the other. With your ears closed and eyes closed, blindly walking ahead, running ahead in order to make headlines, in order to garner support, in order to raise money, in order to run for office even. I mean, that's just where we are right now. And it's unfortunate because there are a large swath of people who don't feel that way. They just don't have the loudest voices. I have a friend who you know as well, and he always says that the activists always have the loudest voices many times, but they don't represent everybody in between. And they don't represent the truth of whatever movement they speak of. And so it's a lonely place, but there are others out there. And there are people like yourself who I truly appreciate in what you do, podcasting and speaking and writing, because it's encouraging to see someone who's open to seeing seeing our issues, our current issues through a biblical perspective. Not that we have it all right or have it all wrong, but being willing to grapple with those things and not falling to the far left or the far right or progressive conservative, but trying to walk that line.
I think the way to put it, Ben, is that solutions don't sell.
You're right.
Yeah, solutions don't sell. It's not. I don't think what you and I are advocating for is moderation per se.
Yeah.
My friend Chris Watkin might call it diagonalization. It's simply a recognition that we need a multifaceted solution, that there's not going to be a solution to the horrible injustice of abortion without some sort of leadership and collaboration across churches, across ethnicities, a holistic approach that deals with the underlying problems of justice and the fears as well as mobilizing different communities and different ethnicities and bringing understanding, but also promoting agency among historically victimized communities. It's going to take everything to be able to get there. And so I wonder if, for people watching this or listening to this, do you care about solutions? Do you actually care about the problem? Or do you care about your tribe winning on an election night? That's fine if your tribe winning on election night is going to contribute to change and solutions. And we have seen some changes that help to get us toward a solution. But there's so much further to go on this question. For decades, the focus was on overturning Roe. Okay, we did it. Well, there's a long way to go. If we're at halftime, I think that's probably optimistic in some ways, Ben.
Yeah. And I think that for a lot of people, and I think that for a lot of people, what we saw and what we can see are those who, for them, this was a political venture, and this was not a journey. This was a cause that had a specific endpoint and end goal, and that was overturning Roe. And now that there is not that, goal to raise money to fight for, to argue about, they're moving on to the next thing. That's the next sexy thing. And I
don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and there's nothing wrong with that, because Roe needed to be overturned.
Right.
I never want to downplay that. I mean, that needed to
That was
go.
a necessary step
Exactly.
in the journey.
But there's more to be had, because the day after Roe was overturned, the relationships, the housing, the health care, the different insecurities, the employment, the lies that are prevalent in culture, all those things were still there waiting at the doors of women. The chemical abortions that are 50% now will be approaching 70 or 80% in the next couple of years is still there. All those factors were still present, even though Roe was overturned. And that's what we need to realize.
Yeah, I don't know, Ben, if people understand the basic politics of abortion, which is that when Roe seemed secure, that in many ways benefited the pro-life cause politically, because there was a segment of people who saw that as an unjust decision, but they never had to worry, practically speaking, about the consequences of it being overturned, the sort of chaos that would ensue, all the debates that would be new, and vice versa. Now that you see Roe overturned, now the pendulum has swung politically to the opposite side, and the pro-choice movement, even after that victory for the pro-life movement, is more ascendant now in elections, because in some ways it's like a lot of pro-life activists and voters were not prepared for the debate. It was so fixated on a Supreme Court decision, they weren't prepared to take it to the streets to talk to people, including a lot of politicians who had their talking points about Roe, but clearly did not have a lot of understanding or conviction about abortion itself, or any understanding about the factors, and might not understand the resolve of a fabulously wealthy pro-choice movement that is not going to go quietly in this country. Anyway, I got a couple more questions here with Ben. We're getting going now. Just as we come toward the end.
Next thing we're talking about the billion. But there's billions of dollars in this, and so I tell you something else that many people weren't prepared for. We weren't prepared for the target that's on our back now.
Yeah,
and I want to legitimize that and say that is a very real feeling and real experience that many people are enduring, that are pro-lifers, that may be in different areas of corporate America, who are being silenced and who are being threatened. And that target is growing, not just for individuals, but for organizations that have any sort of affiliation with the life issue and the life movement. They're dealing with some hardships as well.
Well, sometimes just literal targets. I mean, for the people that are on the front lines of this, it's a real risk, a real risk to body and life, to be standing for life right now. Again, Ben, you cover so many different things. People will know that from your public ministry and your and your work as a football commentator and all kinds of different things, a man of many talents and gifts. One of the things you cover in this book is you talk about how to talk to our kids about sex. And you rightly point out, and I say this all the time when I'm talking about catechesis, you don't talk to your kids about sex. It's not that they're not going to learn. It's just somebody else, namely the internet, that's going to teach them. So I guess part of what I'm asking is, are we supposed to kind of, what do we do? Do we write out a script and do we try to bring this up casually? And I guess the main question is just be real practical here. What age do you begin for a boy or for a girl?
Yeah. I wish I could sit here and say that, I was leading this charge and it was my idea.
Come on, you're the expert, Ben. Come on.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? That it was my idea to talk to the kids about sex early. No, that came from my wife. She urged me. She urged me to talk to my boys and to talk to my girls, even as a dad, to talk to my girls about not just the sex, what it is from a biological standpoint, but from an emotional standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint. And so that has served us greatly in our household because we have open conversations. Our kids are 14 down to 4, identical twin boys that are 4, and they're clueless. I call them Typhoon and Tornado, my 2 identical twin boys, because they're out of control. But so they're not in on the conversation, but they might be around the dinner table and hear some things. I'll tell you what. If you're a parent and you're listening, you don't know how to talk to your kids about sex and you want an easy on-ramp, start reading the book of Genesis with them.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
that's something that I remember my father doing for us as kids and something that I've tried to do with my kids. And we'll go a chapter every few nights. We're not every night like we like to be, but even getting through Genesis 1 through 20. We had a conversation the other day around the table. We were in Genesis 17, the covenant of circumcision.
Oh, there it is.
That was a very robust conversation, especially. And then the next one was like Sodom and Gomorrah. And so
I've had those.
But my point is, as believers, especially, you're 100% right. Our children are going to learn about sex. It's either going to be the internet, it's going to be their own sexual desires, it's going to be a friend on a team. It's going to be a classmate. And depending on what school they go to, it's going to be curriculum in their school that's going to be teaching them things that are outside of what we would want to teach our children. And so it's imperative that we not be reactive, but be proactive. And the way we're proactive is by setting the standards of truth on this issue from what the Word of God says, and so that they will be able to identify where something doesn't line up with that.
Yeah.
But also telling them that, hey, you might mess up. Some of the things that prohibit parents, I think, sometimes from engaging in this conversation is that we are scared that our kids are going to ask us the question we don't want to answer. And what we forget is that we have received the grace of God, and that we can demonstrate to them, I did this, I may have done this right, but my story doesn't have to be your story. And all of our stories are redeemed by the blood of Jesus. But we have to be proactive on this.
Yeah, teach them the good so that they can recognize the bad, and teach them grace because they will almost certainly fall short, as we all have and all do there. Those are good guidelines there. Last question. I just want to give you an opportunity here, Ben. Tell us about some ministries or some pro-life activists, and especially working among African Americans who inspire you.
There's a great friend. She actually wrote the foreword to my book. Her name is Sherilyn Holloway. She runs an organization called Pro-Black, Pro-Life. She lives in Ohio. She is a speaker, mentor. She runs training for churches, actually. So if you're in a church and you want someone to come even talk about or unpack some of the things I talk about in the book from a ethnic as well as abortion standpoint, she does those sorts of things. A good friend that I know you know, Justin Giboney with the AND campaign, Whole Life Project. I've been a great supporter of theirs, and he's a guy who is a leader in that respect, and is able to kind of present this both and but biblical justice as well as addressing social issues on a bunch of different topics. Yeah. He's somebody. I mean, there are some. Christina Bennett is a friend. She works for Live Action. Check her out. But I think there's also this misnomer, this misconception, I should say, among many that pro-life is only attached to a certain political group or a
Right.
certain ethnicity.
Yeah.
And what I've seen and what I've really loved about, my opportunities in speaking and writing and connecting with so many different pro-life organizations like Stand for Life, and even Human Coalition that I work with, is that there are people in every ethnic group that's represented in America in different socioeconomic statuses and different denominations who hold this issue as foundational and important. And no one faction has a death grip on what it means to be pro-life. Now, we may vote differently.
Right.
We may speak about it differently. We may use words like whole life or womb to tomb or pro-life or whatever it may be. If you're Catholic, whatever it is. But there is such complexity in the movement. And so in this post-Roe era, one thing I talk about in the book is we have to have a willingness to, as Frederick Douglass said, unite with anyone to do what's right and no one to do what's wrong.
Yeah.
And be able to connect across those lines. That's difficult. That's hard. We're not trained that way as Americans. But if we want to serve women and we want to save children, that's what we need to be about.
And what could be better and more important? My guest today on Gospelbound has been Benjamin Watson. We've been talking about his new book, The New Fight for Life, Roe, Race, and a Pro-Life Commitment to Justice. It's published by Tyndale Momentum. Ben, my friend, thanks again for this conversation. I look forward to the next time we get to talk.
Man, thank you. Next time, hope we can do it in person, man. We got to catch up.
Would love that. Thanks, Ben.